Ever felt like you're trying to stay clued in, but you're just utterly swamped by this, like, tidal wave of information?
Oh, absolutely. It's a massive challenge.
Especially when you get into things like modern statistics and machine learning. I mean, how do you actually make sense of incredibly complex data when the underlying probability calculations are just too difficult, maybe even impossible to compute exactly?
Yeah, that's a foundational hurdle, really. Take Bayesian statistics, for instance. All our understanding, everything we infer about unknowns, it relies on calculating something called a posterior density.
Right.
But with a lot of today's really sophisticated models, getting that density perfectly, it's often just intractable. You just can't do it.
And that's exactly where our topic for today, variational inference, or VI, steps in, right?
Precisely.
It's this really powerful method from machine learning, kind of like a smart shortcut, you know?
That's a good way to put it.
You can think of it as a way to, well, approximate difficult to compute probability densities.
Yeah.
And it's become, I mean, pretty indispensable because it lets us tackle problems that were just off the table before.
Yeah, for a long time, the main way people did this kind of approximate inference was using Markov chain Monte Carlo MCMC sampling, which is, a very solid, robust tool.
Hmm.
But Vine shows a totally different way to get that approximation. It comes at it through optimization.
Optimization.
Right.
Okay. So our mission for this deep dive seems pretty clear then. We're going to unpack what variational inference actually is, try to understand the core ideas behind how it works,
Yeah.
see how it stacks up against
And
MCMC,
comparison is important.
and really explore why it's become such a critical tool for dealing with like truly massive data sets in these super complex models,
Yeah.
especially in fields moving so fast like computer vision or computational neuroscience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've kind of set the stage for why VI is so vital. Now let's pull back the curtain a bit and really dig into how this smart shortcut actually works piece by piece.
Okay. So, at its heart, variational inference does something quite elegant. It transforms an inference problem, which is hard,
Right.
into an optimization problem, which might be easier to solve.
Okay.
So instead of trying to nail down this exact, super complicated probability density, you sort of set out to find a good enough approximation.
Okay, so approximation is key. How does that process even start? Like, what's the very first step you take?
Well, you begin by positing a family of densities.
A family of densities. Okay.
Yeah. Think of it like choosing a set of simpler candidate shapes, maybe, candidate approximations.
Gotcha.
And your goal then becomes finding the member of that family, the specific shape that is close to the target.
Close to the true complex density you're actually after.
Exactly. The one that best approximates it within the constraints of the family you chose.
And when you say close, how do you measure that? Like quantitatively? Is there a standard ruler for this?
There is, yeah. It's called the Kullback-Leibler divergence, or just KL divergence.
KL divergence. Okay, I've heard of that.
It's a concept from information theory, and it basically tells us how one probability distribution differs from a second reference distribution.
Oh.
Now, a crucial thing to remember is that it's asymmetric. So the KL divergence from Q to P isn't the same as from P to Q.
Right, that's
And
important.
then it's minimized, it goes to zero, only when the two distributions are identical. So when your approximation perfectly matches the target.
So the whole why it works thing really comes down to striking this balance then. You need a family of approximations that's flexible enough to potentially get really close to the true density. But crucially, it also has to be simple enough that you can actually do the optimization efficiently.
That's it exactly. That balance is the core challenge, but also the strength of E.
What's like the biggest pitfall people run into there when choosing that family?
Well, common mistake is choosing a family that's just too simple, one that fundamentally can't capture the important features of the true density, no matter how well you optimize within that family.
Ah, okay. So the flexibility has to be there from the start.
Yeah, you need enough flexibility.
Now, we mentioned MCMC earlier. That's been the workhorse for a long time, right?
Definitely.
So how do we decide? ZIGS versus MCMC. When do you reach for which tool in the toolkit?
It's really important to stress, I think, that there are two different paths to the same goal, right? Both MCMC and V are trying to approximate those tricky posterior densities.
Okay, same destination, different routes.
Exactly.
Right.
MCMC, it generates samples from a Markov chain that eventually converges to the target distribution. 6, like we said, solves an optimization problem to find the best fit within a family.
Right, okay. Two different philosophies. So what are the main trade-offs then? When you're choosing? Is it often speed versus guarantees, maybe.
That's a really key trade-off, yeah. MCMC methods, they come with these nice theoretical guarantees of asymptotically exact samples.
Meaning, if you run it long enough.
If you run it long enough, the samples will eventually represent the true density perfectly, but, and it's a big but, it's generally more computationally intensive.
Takes more time, more resources.
Right. Variational inference, on the other hand, did not enjoy such guarantees. It's only finding the close density within its chosen family.
Okay.
But the payoff is that it tends to be faster, often much faster.
It's almost like choosing between a craftsman who guarantees a perfect custom piece, but it takes ages.
Yeah.
And a really efficient factory, making excellent, maybe not perfectly custom, but really good stuff super quickly.
That's a pretty good analogy, actually. Both are valuable, just for different kinds of jobs.
So for these massive data sets we keep talking about, V sounds like it has a clear edge on scalability.
Oh, absolutely. For scalability, it's a huge win.
But does that speed come at any cost? Or is it just better for big data?
Well, because it's fundamentally based on optimization, V can easily take advantage of methods like stochastic optimization and distributed optimization.
Oh, okay. Things that help with huge data sets.
Exactly, which makes it much better suited for large data sets and also for situations where we want to quickly explore many models. Maybe you're trying out different model structures.
Right, rapid prototyping.
Yeah. MCMC, conversely, is often better suited to smaller data sets and scenarios where we happily pay a heavier computational cost for more precise samples.
Can you give us like a concrete example? A real-world case where one is clearly better.
Sure. Let's say you've spent like 20 years collecting a small but really expensive data set. Maybe it's unique biological samples or something.
Okay, high-stakes data.
High stakes, small volume. And the absolute precision of your inferences is critical. MCMC is probably your go-to there.
Makes sense. Pay the price for the best possible answer.
Right. But now, imagine your job is fitting a probabilistic model of text to 1 billion text documents. A billion.
Wow. Okay.
And you need to use that model to serve search results to a large population of users in, like, milliseconds.
Yeah, this seems like the only option there.
It's the unequivocal winner. Speed and scalability aren't just nice-to-haves, they're essential.
That's a huge difference. What about the model itself? Does the shape or geometry of the posterior distribution matter?
It absolutely does, yeah. For certain models, maybe ones with multiple peaks or modes, think mixture models, something like Gibbs sampling, which is a type of MCMC, can be really good at exploring all those different peaks.
Okay.
But interestingly, the sources show that even sometimes on smaller data sets, Z might actually outperform more general MCMC methods, like Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, just depending on the specific geometry of that posterior landscape.
Huh. So it's not always just about size.
No, it's not always clear-cut. The shape matters, too.
And accuracy. Is there a general tendency for Z? Does it tend to be overconfident or underconfident or?
Generally speaking, Z tends to underestimate the variance of the posterior density.
Okay, so it thinks it's more certain than it maybe should be.
Kind of, yeah. That's often a consequence of the objective function it's optimizing, the KL divergence direction it uses.
Right.
But, and this is important, depending on the task, this underestimation may be acceptable. Maybe you care more about the mean prediction than the exact spread. And actually, empirical research has shown that variational inference does not necessarily suffer in accuracy overall, especially if prediction is your main goal.
So what's the bigger picture here? It sounds like VSI is super powerful, but maybe just one tool among others.
Exactly. It's a really valuable tool sitting right there alongside MCMC in the statisticians or machine learning practitioners' toolbox.
Okay.
Each has its strengths, its weaknesses, its best use cases. But yeah, to really appreciate VI, we probably need to dig into how it actually pulls off this optimization trick.
Yes, perfect segue. Let's get into the engine room, the actual mechanics. You said minimizing KL divergence directly is hard because it depends on that evidence term.
Right, the log PX, the log evidence.
That you usually can't compute.
Exactly. That PX is the probability of seeing your data, averaged over all possible settings of your model's parameters or latent variables. It's often called the marginal likelihood or evidence. And for complex models, calculating that single number is, well, often the intractable problem we were trying to avoid in the first place. It might require summing or integrating over an exponentially large space.
Okay, so if you can't compute the KL divergence directly because of this evidence term, what do you optimize instead? How do you actually get around that?
This is where the clever trick comes in. We use a proxy. It's called the evidence lower bound, or ELBO for short.
ELBO, okay, evidence lower bound.
Yep. And the mathematical beauty is that maximizing this ELBO is provably equivalent to minimizing the KL divergence between your approximation and the true posterior.
Whoa, okay. So maximizing one thing achieves the minimization of the other without needing the tricky evidence term.
Exactly. The ELBO itself is computable using just your approximate density, the model's likelihood, and the prior. The intractable evidence term cancels out, essentially.
That is clever. So intuitively, what does this ELBO represent? What's it actually encouraging the approximation to do?
You can think of the ELBO as having two main components or forces acting on your approximation. Okay.
One term basically encourages densities that place their mass on configurations of the latent variables that explain the observed data.
All right.
It pushes the approximation towards explaining what you actually saw.
Makes sense. Fit the data.
Right, maximizing the likelihood, essentially. The second term is a negative divergence, usually between the approximation and the prior distribution. This term encourages densities close to the prior.
Ah, so it pulls it back towards your initial beliefs or assumptions?
Exactly. So the ELBO naturally encodes this balance. Fit the data well, but stay reasonably close to what you believed beforehand, the prior.
That really does sound like it mirrors that classic likelihood versus prior trade-off we always see in Bayesian stats.
It does, yeah. It's built right into the objective function. It's designed to find that sweet spot.
Okay, great. And how do we actually choose that family of densities we talked about way back at the start? What's the most common, maybe simplest approach people take?
By far the most common starting point is the mean field variational family. It's often seen as the simplest approach to variational inference, mean field. Okay, what's the defining feature there?
The key assumption in the mean field approach is that within your approximating distribution, the Q distribution, the latent variables are mutually independent and each governed by a distinct factor.
Okay, hold on. Mutually independent. So you're basically assuming that in your approximation, knowing the value of one hidden variable tells you nothing about the value of another hidden variable.
Exactly. Each variable gets its own little independent distribution within the overall approximation.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a really strong assumption, a big simplification. What's the trade-off? What do you lose by making that assumption?
Well, the upside is that it makes the optimization much, much simpler. But the big downside is that while it can be flexible enough to capture the individual marginal densities quite well.
So the distribution of each variable considered alone.
Right. But it fundamentally cannot capture correlation between them. If the true posterior has variables that are strongly related, the mean field approximation just won't see that relationship.
That sounds pretty significant. Can you help us visualize that? Like, what does that look like in practice, that failure to capture correlation?
Yeah, the source material has a great illustration, figure 1. Imagine the true posterior is a two-dimensional Gaussian distribution, but it's highly correlated, so it looks like a tilted, stretched out oval or ellipse.
Okay, so variable 1 and variable 2 clearly move together.
Right. Now, if you try to approximate that with a mean field Gaussian, your approximation has to be a product of two independent Gaussians. Its contours will always be circles or axis-aligned ellipses. It can never be tilted.
Ah, I see. It can't capture that lean.
Exactly. And what typically happens is that the mean field approximation ends up being much narrower. It underrepresents the true variance or spread.
Why narrower? Why does it shrink?
It's because of how the KL divergence works. KL cum P heavily penalizes the approximation Q if it puts probability mass where the true density P is 0 or very low. To avoid that penalty, the approximation tends to play it safe and contract inwards, focusing its mass where the true density is highest, even if that means it fails to cover the full extent of the true density's tails or its correlations.
So it becomes overly confident and misses the real uncertainty.
Right.
Because it can't model the dependencies.
That's a good way to summarize it. The independence assumption simplifies things massively, but comes at the cost of potentially missing important structure like correlations and underestimating uncertainty.
Okay, that makes the trade-off really clear.
Yeah.
So assuming we've chosen our family, maybe mean field, how do we actually do the optimization? How do we maximize that ELBO?
Right. So one of the most common workhorse algorithms for this, especially with the mean field family, is called coordinate ascent variational inference, or CAO.
Okay, coordinate ascent. How does that work? What's the process?
It's an iterative algorithm. Think of it like trying to find the highest point on a hill, but you're only allowed to take steps parallel to the coordinate axis, like only north-south or only east-west at each step.
No.
KAVI iteratively optimizes each factor of the mean field variational distribution while holding the others fixed.
So it picks one variable's approximating distribution, tunes it up to improve the ELBO as much as possible, keeping everything else constant.
Yep.
Then it moves to the next variable's distribution, tunes that one, holding the others fixed.
Exact.
And it just cycles through all the variables like that.
Precisely. It keeps cycling through, updating each factor one by one, and with each update, the ELBO is guaranteed to increase or stay the same. So it climbs the ELBO to a local optimum.
Local optimum. Okay,
Yeah.
we'll come back to that. This process, updating one thing while holding others fixed, it sounds kind of familiar. Is there a connection to MCMC methods here, maybe give sampling?
There's a very, very close connection, actually. It's quite insightful. Both KAVI and Gibbs sampling rely on calculating what are called complete conditionals.
Which is the distribution of one variable given the data and the current values of all the other variables.
Exactly. It's like, if you knew everything else, what would the distribution of this one variable look like? Okay. Now, here's the key difference in what they do with that complete conditional. Gibbs sampling literally draws a random sample from it. CAVI, instead, takes the expected log of that complete conditional distribution to derive the optimal update for its corresponding variational factor.
Ah, okay. So Gibbs samples from the conditional, CAVI, calculates an expectation from the conditional to update its approximation.
You got it. It really shows how these seemingly very different approaches, sampling versus optimization, can share some deep underlying mathematical structures.
That's fascinating. Okay, back to that local optimum point. What are the practical things you need to worry about when actually running CAVI? Does the starting point matter?
It absolutely can matter because the ELBO in general is a non-convex objective function.
Meaning it can have multiple peaks, like a landscape with several hills, not just one big mountain.
Exactly. So where you start the CAVI algorithm, the initialization can determine which peak, which local optimum it ends up climbing. Figure 2 in the source material shows this visually. Different starting points can lead to different final ELBO values.
So you might not find the best possible approximation within your family.
That's a risk. However, for some models, like mixture models, there's often an issue called label switching, where multiple optima might actually represent essentially the same underlying clustering, just with the cluster labels permuted. In those cases, finding any good mode might be perfectly fine.
Okay. So how do you know when to stop? How do you assess convergence?
Typically, you monitor the ELBO value itself. You keep iterating, and when the improvement in the ELBO from one full cycle to the next becomes very small, below some tolerance threshold, you declare convergence.
Makes sense.
For larger data sets, calculating the full ELBO every time can be slow, so people sometimes monitor the performance, like the average log predictive probability, on a small, separate, held-out data set.
Okay. And any technical tricks, like dealing with tiny numbers?
Oh yeah, numerical stability is always important. When you're dealing with probabilities, which can be very small, it's almost always better to work with the logarithms of probabilities to avoid underflow issues.
Right, work in log space.
Exactly. And there's a common technique called the log sum x trick, which is essential for robustly calculating things like the log of a sum of exponentiated values, which comes up all the time in these models.
Good practical tips.
Yeah.
All right, let's try to make this even more concrete. Can we walk through a complete example? Maybe that Bayesian mixture of Gaussians model you mentioned.
Yeah, that's an excellent example to see it all in action. So remember the setup.
Yeah.
You have k mixture components, or clusters. You have n data points you want to assign to these clusters. Each cluster k has a mean parameter, and each data point n has a hidden cluster assignment variable.
Okay.
When you apply CAVI to this model, you typically use Gaussian variational factors to approximate the posterior distribution of the cluster means, and you use categorical variational factors for the cluster assignments for each data point.
So an approximation for where the clusters are centered and an approximation for which cluster each point belongs to.
Exactly. And you just run the CAVI updates, cycling through the updates for the means and the updates for the assignments until the ELBO converges.
And once it's converged, once you've fitted this variational density, what can you actually do with it? What insights do you get?
Well, several things. You can use it for posterior decomposition of the data. Basically, for each data point, you can look at its fitted categorical distribution and assign it to the cluster with the highest probability. You get a clustering of your data.
Okay, grouping the data.
You can also use the fitted variational density to approximate the predictive density of new data. So if a new data point comes along, you can estimate the probability of seeing that point, given the clusters you've learned. Useful for classification or anomaly detection, maybe.
Right. Okay, now for a real-world test, The image analysis example in the sources sounded pretty cool. What was the setup there?
Yeah, that was a neat demonstration. The goal was to group a bunch of images based purely on their color profiles.
Okay.
So each image was converted into this 576-dimensional representation. They did this by basically calculating color histograms for red, green, and blue, each with a certain number of bins, and then just concatenating the three color histograms together.
So a long vector summarizing the colors in the image.
Exactly. A sort of color fingerprint.
And what did they do with TAV?
They used TAVI to fit a Gaussian mixture model with 30 clusters, K30, to a dataset of 10,000 images, represented by these 576-dimensional vectors.
And what did the results look like? Did it actually group similar images?
It did, yeah. Figure 5 in the source shows some examples. It displays images assigned to 4 randomly chosen clusters out of the 30, and you can see visually that the images within each cluster look pretty similarly colored. So KV successfully found meaningful structure based on color.
That's pretty convincing visually. But
Yeah.
the really striking part, I think you mentioned, was the speed. How did it compare?
Ah, yes. This is where CX, specifically CVI in this case, really demonstrated its advantage for this kind of task. They compared it directly to a standard MCMC approach using Hamiltonian Monte Carlo implemented in STAN.
Okay, a head-to-head comparison.
And the result was pretty dramatic. The source states KV is orders of magnitude faster than the sampling algorithm.
Orders of magnitude, like 10x,
Yeah.
100x.
Easily 100x or more in many cases. Figure 6 shows the timing CAVI fitted the entire model to those 10,000 high-dimensional image vectors in less than a minute.
Less than a minute. For 10,000 images, that's actually kind of amazing.
It really highlights the practical speed advantage, especially when you need results quickly or need to analyze large data sets where MCMC might just take too long to be practical.
Okay, so CAVI is fast, much faster than traditional MCMC for something like that. But what happens when we go even bigger? Not 10,000 images, but maybe millions. Or billions, like that text example. Does even CAVI hit a wall?
Yeah, exactly. Even CAVI, while efficient compared to sampling, can still struggle with truly massive data.
Why is that? What's the bottleneck?
The core issue is that standard CAVI in each iteration needs to cycle through the entire dataset to compute the updates for the global parameters, like the cluster means in the mixture model example.
Okay. So every single update step requires looking at every single data point.
Right, and if your dataset has millions or billions of points, that repeated pass through the entire dataset just becomes computationally infeasible. It takes too long.
So we need another leap, something beyond CAVI for that kind of web-scale data. What enables that next level of scaling? Is there a prerequisite?
Well, one thing that helps enormously is if your model belongs to a class called conditional conjugate exponential families. Basically, if the complete conditional distributions we talked about earlier are all within the standard exponential family of distributions, like Gaussian, Gamma, Dirichlet, etc.
Okay, that's a bit technical, but it simplifies things mathematically.
Massively.
Right.
It makes deriving the CAVI updates much easier, often yielding closed-form equations, and importantly, it provides the foundation needed for the next step in scaling, which leads us to stochastic variational inference, or SVI.
SVI. Okay, stochastic. That sounds like it involves randomness, maybe sampling.
It does, but in a different way than MCMC. SVI is the key to making VI work on truly massive data sets. It does this by using techniques from stochastic optimization.
How does that work? How does it avoid looking at the whole data set?
Instead of calculating the exact update direction based on all the data, which is slow, SVI follows noisy but cheap-to-compute gradients.
Noisy gradients. How do you get those?
At each step, instead of using the whole data set, SVI just subsamples a data point at random, or maybe a small mini batch of data points.
Okay.
It then computes an update direction based only on that small subset of data. It's a noisy estimate of the true gradient, but it's incredibly fast to compute.
And following these noisy directions still works. It still finds a good optimum.
Amazingly, yes. Stochastic optimization theory tells us that if you decrease the step size appropriately over time, following these noisy gradients will still converge to a local optimum, just like the full batch gradient ascent would, but much, much faster per iteration for large data sets.
Wow. What about natural gradients? I think the source mentioned those too.
Ah, yes. Natural gradients are another key ingredient that often makes SVI work much better in practice.
What do they do?
Think of the space of probability distributions. It has a natural geometric structure. It's not like flat Euclidean space. Natural gradients account for the geometric structure of probability parameters.
Okay. So they take smarter steps.
Essentially, yes. They often lead to much faster convergence and better stability compared to using standard Euclidean gradients. And conveniently, for exponential family models, the natural gradient is often easier to calculate than the Euclidean gradient.
Easier and better. That sounds great.
It's a really nice alignment for these kinds of models.
Yeah, so what's the really big win with SVI? Does it require a whole new set of derivations compared to KV?
This is perhaps the most compelling part from a practical standpoint. For models in that nice exponential family class, SVI requires no new derivation beyond what is needed for KV.
Seriously. Yeah.
The updates look almost identical, just applied using stochastic gradients based on mini batches instead of full batch calculations. This means any implementation of KV can be immediately scaled up to a stochastic algorithm with relatively minor changes.
That's huge.
Yeah.
It dramatically lowers the barrier to entry for tackling massive data problems.
It really does. It was a major breakthrough.
Can you give us a killer app example? Where has SVI made something possible that just wasn't before?
Probabilistic topic models are the classic example. Models like latent Dirichlet allocation, LDA.
Right, used for finding hidden themes in large text collections.
Exactly. They help uncover the latent topics that run through a collection of documents. Think about analyzing all of Wikipedia, or millions of news articles, or scientific papers.
Okay, massive scale text.
Before SVI, fitting LDA to truly large corpora was extremely challenging, very slow. But with SVI, topic models scale up to millions of documents.
Billions.
Yeah. Figure 7 in the source material shows an example. Topics inferred using the latent Dirichlet allocation model from 1.8 M articles from the New York Times.
Wow, 1.8 million articles.
And the source explicitly says this analysis would not have been possible without SVI. It just opened up a whole new scale of analysis for these kinds of models.
That really drives home the impact. Okay, so we've covered the core ideas, the comparison with MCMC, the mechanics like ILBO and KVI, and how SVI lets it scale massively. Where else is VI being used today? What's the breadth of application, and what's next?
Oh, the applications are incredibly broad now. SISIS is being used to solve real problems across so many different fields.
Like what? Give us a quick tour.
Okay, rapid fire. Computational biology. Things like genome-wide association studies, analyzing population genetics, computer vision and robotics, image denoising, object tracking, simultaneous localization and mapping, SLAM, place recognition for robots,
Right.
computational neuroscience, analyzing fMRI time series, building brain-computer interfaces,
Wow.
natural language processing and speech recognition, beyond topic modeling, things like parsing sentences, building better speech recognition systems.
Okay.
And the list goes on. The source also mentions marketing, optimal control, astrophysics, and the social sciences. It's really becoming a standard tool in the modern quantitative toolkit.
It's clearly made a huge impact already. What about the theory behind it? Is our understanding of VIAV as deep as it is for MCMC, which has been studied for longer?
That's a fair point. The statistical properties of variational inference are not yet well understood, at least not with the same depth and completeness as MCMC theory.
Okay.
There's active research trying to catalyze research in this area to build a more solid theoretical foundation. We know about some properties, like the tendency to underestimate the variance of the posterior density, but understand all the nuances, convergence properties in different settings, that's still ongoing work.
So still some open questions on the theory side. What are some of the really exciting frontiers then? Where is VIAV research heading?
There are several really interesting directions. One is exploring other divergence measures besides the standard KL divergence we discussed.
Why would you do that?
Different divergence measures might have different properties. Maybe they don't underestimate variance as much, or perhaps they are better suited for specific types of posterior geometries, even if optimizing them presents new challenges.
Okay, exploring different ways to measure closeness. What else?
Another major push is developing better approximations while maintaining efficient optimization. This could mean designing more flexible variational families than mean field, families that can capture correlations, for example, but are still tractable enough to optimize. Or finding ways to perhaps correct for that known variance underestimation after the fact.
Making the approximations better without losing the speed advantage.
Exactly. And then there's the really intriguing interface between variational inference and MCMC.
Trying to get the best of both worlds.
Precisely. How can we combine these powerful strategies? Maybe use a quick VI approximation to initialize a more refined MCMC run, or use MCMC steps within a VI algorithm to handle parts that are difficult to optimize directly. There's a lot of creative work happening there.
Fascinating stuff. Well, this has been an absolutely illuminating deep dive. We've really unpacked variational inference, this optimization-based approach to approximating complex probability distributions.
Yeah, highlighting its speed, its
Yeah.
scalability.
And just its incredible impact across so many scientific and technical fields. It's really changed what's possible.
It really is a compelling example of how finding clever ways to approximate to get a good enough answer quickly can unlock modeling capabilities that were just out of reach when we insisted on exact solutions.
So, wrapping up, what does this all mean for you, our listener? As we keep generating data at an ever-increasing pace, data sets that are more massive, more complex than ever before, this ability to quickly and effectively understand them, even if that understanding involves settling for a close approximation rather than an exact perfect answer, that ability is becoming not just, useful, but absolutely essential.
Couldn't agree more.
So the question to leave you with is, what new frontiers, what new discoveries will be unlocked as we continue to sharpen and refine these incredibly powerful tools for approximate inference?